What's up everyone, it's King Moosh here with JCross X to welcome you all back for episode 6 of Unit Overview. In this series we will be analyzing all the playable units in Fire Emblem 3 houses regarding their recruitment requirements, personal abilities, stats, spell lists, and everything in between to determine their strengths and limitations as a unit in your army. We'll also be providing potential class recommendations for all these units as well as ranking them on a tier list at the end of our analysis. These videos are generally gameplay focused, so we do our best to avoid story spoilers, but we always advise you to watch with discretion anyways, and if you haven't played 3 houses yet, we highly recommend that you do.
This episode will be focused on Bernadetta von Varley of the Black Eagles house. If you choose to teach the Black Eagles in Chapter 1, she will be automatically recruited and available to deploy for the mock battle. Recruiting her out of house isn't too difficult though. Thankfully, unlike Ferdinand, who only has a C support with Byleth available before the time skip, Bernadetta can go up to her B support pre-time skip. If you do reach her B support before the skip, she will also have a chance to randomly ask you to join your house during the week, which as per usual, bypasses all stat and skill requirements. Like we mentioned before, this is RNG dependent, so you can save and roll for this random occurrence as much as you wish. As for her requirements, the stat she desires for when recruiting is strength, with her skill requirement being bow. Starting at no support at all, her requirement is 20 strength and C bow. Honestly, this seems high, but considering Byleth has a very respectable 13 base strength and it's a stat you want to prioritize anyways, this isn't too bad. Same applies to the C bow, since most units want to push to that margin for the archer certification, Byleth included. Handman is pretty much always available for faculty training, and he does help train bows, which does make this a bit easier. Anna and Shamir are also available for bow training as well. The requirements get easier as you rank up her support, with her C rank dropping the strength requirement to 16, her C plus rank dropping the strength below Byleth's base to 12 and D plus bow, and B rank dropping the requirements all the way down to 8 strength and D bow. To reach her higher ranks, you can give her some of her favorite gifts, which actually include a fair amount of items. She likes the pitcher plant, armored bear stuffy, book of sheet music, watering can, landscape painting, dapper handkerchief, and the owl feather like every other unit. You can also find her lost items too. Her needle and thread can be found in the student dormitory starting at Chapter 5, right around where she lives. Her still life picture can also be found in the same location starting in Chapter 8. Lastly, her headshot case can be found in the cemetery starting in Chapter 11. Tea parties are also great ways to raise support, and to have an easier time with Bernadetta specifically, you should use one of her favorite tea blends. Those are the Albanian Berry Blend and the Honeyed Fruit Blend, as well as the Crest Blend and the Lesser Cortania like every other unit. Being from a noble family, Bernadetta also has a crest, the Minor Crest of Indec. It has a 10% chance to activate and grants the Brave effects to her, which means that she attacks twice before the enemy unit can retaliate. This is obviously a very strong effect, and if you have her primarily using bows, you can safely go for the crest proc without putting her in danger if it doesn't trigger. Unfortunately, the activation rate is quite low, so like most crests, it's not very reliable.
Bernadetta's personal ability is Persecution Complex. It's a very simple ability that grants her a flat +5 boost to all damage she deals whenever she isn't at full HP. This applies to all damage, including magic and gambits, not just regular physical attacks. You can only be missing a single point of HP, or you can be at 1 HP, and it will still activate either way. The activation condition is extremely easy to reach and maintain. All she needs to do to activate it is to survive being attacked by an enemy once. While she is frail defensively, she has solid speed which can allow her to avoid being one-rounded, even when playing on maddening difficulty. Since she has a crest, she unfortunately doesn't have the ability to damage herself by using heroes relics, but she can still take advantage of devil weaponry for consistent self-damage. Unlike Ferdinand, she doesn't have to deal with the issue of her personal ability getting disabled by gaining HP from leveling up. In fact, that would actually activate Persecution Complex on its own. She can even use HP boosting consumable items in the middle of battle for the same effect. This is an excellent personal ability that really improves Bernadetta's viability. The +5 damage boost is extremely significant all the way throughout the game, equivalent to that of a weapon fair ability, but it especially stands out in the early game. It's a higher boost than almost every other personal ability that boosts damage, single-handedly offsetting her middling base strength to make her one of the best damage dealers in the first few chapters. If an attack hits multiple times, the boost will apply on each individual hit, so it works even better with doubling builds, brave weapons, and brave combat arts. Bernadetta also has some other incentives in her kit to lower her own HP, which we will mention later, so this ability synergizes really well with the rest of her kit.
At first glance, Bernadetta looks like she has a pretty volatile set of skill levels. Let's start with the Banes in this case, and she does have a few unfortunate ones. She has quite a few, 3 of which are physical weapon types, those being sword, axes, and brawling. To start off with swords, this is mildly unfortunate since Bernadetta is a relatively fast unit, so she would generally be pretty decent at Swordmaster, especially with Persecution Complex proccing on every hit of Astra. Even if this reduces flexibility a bit, sword classes in this game aren't the most impactful, so it isn't the biggest deal. Same goes for brawling, as there are very limited options for female units in terms of brawling classes. The Axebane is easily the most significant, as some of the most important masteries such as Deathblow are locked behind Axe-focused classes. Additionally, the Wyvern classes are some of the best in this game, and as such, certifying into them becomes significantly more difficult. Thankfully, as a female she at least has access to Falcon Knight, but it's still important to mention the Bane's downside regardless. Lastly, she's a pretty insignificant bane to heavy armor. Armored classes are pretty niche in this game, and as someone as frail as Bernadetta doesn't really fit into the archetype of his armored class as well, so this bane is barely impactful, if at all. While she does have a fair amount of banes, Bernadetta does get 2 really nice boons as well as a budding talent. She has one in bows, which is arguably the best weapon type in the game, and as such, helps her certify for good bow classes like Archer and Sniper much easier. Her Lance boon also helps her push for a very important combat art I'll mention later. Being able to acquire it fast as well as synergizing with a good lance class such as Paladin is really nice and made even easier considering she has a budding talent in riding, which will become a boon after 12 teaching sessions. You also get the added benefit of having Bernadetta learn the ability Pass, which Josh will describe in more detail soon. Overall, despite having a lot of banes, most of them don't even matter aside from the unfortunate one in Axes. Meanwhile, the boons she adds are all great, basically covering all the classes that she wants in the mid to late game.
Unfortunately, I have very few good things to say about Bernadetta's base stats. Looking at her defenses, she starts with a mediocre 25 HP as well as 4 defense and 2 res, which are both subpar. This makes her one of the most frail units in the game from the very start. As you would expect from a primarily physical unit, her base magic of 5 isn't very good. She has 7 speed, 5 luck, and 6 charm, which are all pretty average. Thankfully, her base speed is usually just barely high enough that she can avoid being doubled in early game maddening. Her base 8 strength is also very average, though as I mentioned before, Persecution Complex can offset this. If I could point to one good stat, it would be her base dex of 7, but this is still only slightly above average. Her growth rates aren't particularly good either, but they are a little better than her bases. To start with the positives, her 55% dex growth and 50% speed growth are both very good. However, once again, her defensive profile is very lacking, with 20% defense growth, 30% res growth, and 35% HP growth. That HP growth in particular is unfortunate because of the combat art we'll mention later. Her luck and charm are also both falling in the average to mediocre range at 25% and 35% respectively. Once again, her magic disappoints with only a 20% growth rate, which doesn't really matter for most builds, though it is unfortunate because she has a good spell list. Finally, her most disappointing growth rate is definitely that 35% strength growth. It's one of the lowest in the game among units who are actually inclined towards physical classes. She thankfully has other tools to increase her damage output, but this is definitely a limiting factor for her. Overall, Bernadetta really isn't a very statistically good unit at all, aside from her dex and speed.
Bernadetta only gets a couple dependent combat arts, but the ones she does get are pretty great. Starting off with her favored weapon, the bow, she has 2. At C+ rank, she acquires Deadeye. This art has pretty limited distribution and is actually pretty good, as for 5 durability, increases might by 6 and has a very long range, allowing units to hit enemies from 3 to 5 tiles away from them. The combat art applies no boost to hit, so you do have to be mindful of low hit rates when firing at max range, but the benefit of being able to snipe high value threats potentially even through walls from a considerable distance is definitely worth it. This is especially the case as classes such as Archer, Sniper, and Bow Knight can increase this range even further with bow range +1 and +2 respectively. At A rank, Bernadetta acquires Encloser, a solid all-rounder combat art with a decent effect that prevents enemies from moving for 1 turn. The combat art itself only has a cost of 3 durability, while boosting might by 4 and hit by 15, providing decent damage and reliability if you do want to potentially disable a high-value threat for 1 turn. That's personally how I'd recommend using the art, as using one of your unit's turns to guarantee that a strong enemy doesn't have the opportunity to attack can buy you time to clear out other weaker units in the meantime. In niche situations, you can also use this art to prevent enemies from running away in certain missions. It's definitely a nice utility to have in her combat art selection. Lastly, we have the esteemed combat art Vengeance. At first glance, the combat art doesn't look too special, costing 4 durability for only +2 to might and a +10 to crit. However, it has the very strong effect where its power increases quite significantly depending on how low the user's HP is. While Bernadetta isn't the unit with the highest HP pool, this combat art still allows her to deal significant damage with lances on top of her personal and okay strength growth. She unfortunately can't use Hero's Relics to lower her HP because she has a crest, but like Josh said earlier, Devil Weapons still work, and there are other ways to lower HP such as damaging terrain on maps that have it. As such, Dedu is debatably the better user of this art, since not only does he have higher HP and strength, he doesn't have a crest either. However, being female provides her access to both Pegasus and Falcon Knight, which is a huge win for her viability regarding this combat art specifically. Regardless of who you believe is the superior Vengeance user, it's still really nice that she can get this art and it provides her a lot of potential damage output on Lance classes, which she can slot into easily with her Lance boon. Overall, while Bernadetta doesn't have the widest selection of combat arts at her disposal, the ones she does have are great quality.
Bernadetta doesn't have a long list of dependent abilities, but the 2 she gets are really great. She only gets a single one from her authority rank, Battalion Wrath, obtained from rank C. Like most of the other battalion abilities, it activates only when your unit's equipped battalion is at 1/3 or lower of its max endurance. When this ability is active, it grants Bernadetta a flat +50 to crit whenever an enemy initiates combat with her, so unfortunately not during the player phase. She has naturally high dexterity, so when you pair this ability alongside high crit rate weapons like the Killer Lance, you can pretty much guarantee crits during the enemy phase. Bernadetta is very frail, so in order to survive an attack, you will most likely need a dodge tank build. Usually, the best way to take advantage of this ability is in flying classes alongside Avoid +10 and Alert Stance Plus, pairing with her naturally high speed. Bernadetta's player phase is so good that I don't think this build is necessarily optimal, but it's definitely strong, and having another build option is always great for versatility. The other ability, Pass, comes from unlocking her budding talent of riding, as we previously mentioned. She is one of only 3 playable units in the game who can obtain this ability, the others being Anna and Claude. When equipped, it allows her to pass directly through tiles that enemies are already occupying instead of having to go around them. This is a simple but excellent buff to mobility that shines on her because she is already inclined towards high mobility flying and cavalry classes throughout the game. Movement is king in this game, so I would highly recommend unlocking your budding talent as soon as possible to pick up this ability.
Although typically tailored towards physical classes, Bernadetta's spell list is relatively expansive with a few gems thrown in there. Starting at D reason, Bernadetta gets Blizzard as a starting spell, which is okay. Just like Thunder, it weighs a bit more than a few of the other starting spells like Wind and Fire, also being pretty inaccurate with only a 70 hit rate, which is even lower than Thunder's at 80. Its might is also average with 3, but the one stat where it shines above the rest is crit, sitting at 15. While this is definitely pretty high for a spell, it's hard to ignore the main drawback of how inconsistent the spell could be in terms of accuracy, especially in the early game where it'll see its most use. It does at least have 10 uses though, which is the same as Fire, and more than Thunder. Speaking of Thunder, Bernadetta gets that spell at D+ reason. This unfortunately doesn't solve the consistency issue as Thunder isn't much more accurate as I just mentioned, but it does at least have slightly higher might of 4, while still having an okay crit of 5. Next up, she gets Thoron at C, just like Ferdinand and Dorothea from the last few episodes. This is definitely one of the standouts of her list, as you might expect given what we have said about this spell before. While it only has 4 uses, it's a considerable bump in might, up to 9, and having a solid crit of 10, with the main appeal of the spell being the extra tile of range it grants. Unfortunately for Bernadetta, the spell is still relatively unreliable at 75 hit, right between Thunder and Blizzard. The situation isn't fixed with her final spell at the A rank either, being Fimbulvetter. The spell is the least accurate on our list, having only 65 hit, which is pretty bad. For a heavy spell, its weight is relatively light though at 10, but it's not like doubling with the spell would be entirely optimal since it only has 3 uses. Being one of the black magic spells associated with ice in this game, it has pretty decent might at 12, while also bolstering one of the highest crit rates for spells at 25. This is definitely above average as most spells have very little to no crit, but it's debatable if the hefty penalty to accuracy is worth it. At the very least, since it's later in the game, you'll probably at least have different ways to offset its low chance of hit. In terms of her Faith spell list, she gets Heal and Nosferatu at D and D+ Faith respectively, providing basic healing and white magic damage like every other unit. Moving on to her next spell, she gets Physic at C Faith, which is actually pretty solid for healing purposes, given its significantly increased range over heal. However, just like Josh said before, Bernadetta's magic growth isn't the best, and as such her Physic range won't be nearly as long as more dedicated spellcasters. The same also applies to her last spell, Rescue at A Faith. Rescue is a great spell that drags an allied unit back to a tile adjacent to the caster. While it does also scale off of magic for its range, Bernadetta's magic will probably be pretty decent by the time you acquire this spell if you do plan to use her spells. Regardless, Rescue is pretty much always impactful, as pulling allied units out of potentially dangerous tiles after using their turn to presumably kill or weaken a unit is great utility for Bernadetta. There are plenty of other scenarios where it can be useful too, such as helping units with lower move traverse the map faster, or pulling allies out of danger after being rattled by a gambit. Overall, Bernadetta's spell list is not without its flaws, but it's still quite good. The main issue for her magically speaking is just that her growth for magic is not great like I just said, along with the fact that her entire reason spell list just doesn't have a reliable and consistent spell, meaning that she will be a bit shaky to use as a spellcaster. Despite all that, for a unit that can perform so well physically, it's nice that she can at least have a very respectable spell list if you do want to take her down the magic path.
Bernadetta has quite a lot of things going for her. First of all, her early game is extremely good. Her personal ability keeps her damage output high despite her middling strength. She starts with Curve Shot and will likely pick up Tempest Lance very early as well, which are the 2 best combat arts in the early game. She can get Vengeance after only a few chapters, which provides a massive damage spike that allows her to one-round enemies for literally the entire game. She's the only female Vengeance user, which lets her stand out in terms of class options. Unlike Dedu and Cyril, she can utilize Pegasus Knight with Vengeance, making her one of the best units in the game in terms of combat performance during the intermediate stage. Also, she gets access to Falcon Knight later as an endgame flying Lancefarer class option, which the other 2 don't have. Her access to Pass is extremely unique, which makes her stand out even more in her role as a hypermobile nuke. She can easily traverse the map and slip past enemy defenses to assassinate key targets. Aside from her damage output, she also gets really good utility from her bow combat arts, allowing her to chip enemies from very far away or lock them in place to help out your other units. She even somehow has good utility spells too on top of all that. She's honestly just an extremely impressive unit in almost every aspect of combat, but she's fairly easy to recruit so you can use her in any playthrough. It's also worth mentioning that if you have both Bernadetta and Petra recruited, starting in Chapter 14, you'll be able to access the Foreign Land and Sky Paralog battle. It's a difficult one, but it does give you a few useful battalions as a reward.
Bernadetta is a great unit with very little to talk about in terms of weaknesses, but there are a few. The main one I mentioned earlier when talking about skills is definitely that Axebane. Even if she acquires Falcon Knight later, Wyvern Rider serves as a nice transitional option to that class for females after Pegasus Knight, allowing them to be flyers for most of a playthrough. However, given how crucial death blow is for most physical units, if you already push her to see axes for Brigand, it can be managed to at least get her axes close enough to Wyvern Rider's requirements to at least start gambling the certification, since she has much less issues when training flying and lances. Additionally, her stats aren't the best, but there are a few workarounds. For strength, her personal offsets it quite a bit in the early game, and Vengeance, which is much more dependent on how low a unit's HP is for damage, means that she doesn't even need to have the highest strength to utilize that art, especially since she'll have a bonus 5 to her damage when using it as well. Additionally, one of her better class options is Sniper, which has access to the extremely broken combat art Hunter's Volley, which has the Brave effect. This also has synergy with her personal, given the fact that it will apply twice on each attack with the art. While her base speed isn't the best and could be problematic early on, Josh did mention that it's at least fast enough that if she unequips her weapon, she can avoid being doubled, unlike other units with lower base speed such as Caspar. She's also somewhat frail, but debatably this can work in her favor. Assuming she isn't getting one-rounded, if she takes a lot of damage from the get-go, not only will her personal be activated, but she can start doing a lot more damage with Vengeance sooner rather than later. Overall, there really isn't too much to talk about. Bernadetta's few shortcomings as a unit are relatively minor, and even though the Axebane is arguably her worst one, she's a relatively low investment unit otherwise, given the boons she does have are great and provide her good options, so that even that isn't the biggest deal.
Normally, we start with the beginner classes, but for this video I like to briefly mention the Commoner Noble stage. Mastering Noble is really important for Bernadetta. I don't even think it's possible to reach level 5 without mastering it, but once you do, make sure to equip HP plus 5 since it's particularly useful for her compared to most other units. Moving on to our beginner class options, Fighter is the obvious choice. She can certify for it for free because of her starting bow rank, and Strength plus 2 is the most useful mastery ability for her at this stage. There's an argument for potentially choosing Soldier instead in order to pick up Reposition, which is much better positional combat art than Shove. You should usually be raising her lance rank early anyways, so you often meet the certification requirements by coincidence. However, her combat art slots are heavily contested, especially later in the game, so I don't think Reposition is worth the effort on her. Next, let's look at the intermediate classes. The first one you should go for is almost certainly Archer. It's the easiest intermediate class for her to certify into because of her affinity for bows. Archer is a pretty good class in terms of combat performance, granting extra bow range, but the most important benefit is its mastery ability, hit plus 20. This is an essential ability to pick up, especially on Madney difficulty. For Bernadetta specifically, it's really helpful for her combat arts like Vengeance, which have no buff to hit rate, and Deadeye, which is often very inaccurate at its strongest range. You will also definitely want to master Brigand for Death Blow. This is difficult to certify into because of Bernadetta's Bane and Axes, but Death Blow is essential, and is absolutely worth pushing through the Bane to obtain. I would recommend raising Axes to D+, and then gambling the certification. As for her best combat performance classes, Pegasus Knight immediately stands out. It's not hard for her to certify into because of her Lance boon, and the class's combination of 6 move, flight, and canto gives it incredible combat performance for this stage of the game. The mastery ability, Darting Blow, pairs well with Bernadetta's great speed, though she often uses combat arts which reduces its value a bit. Cavalier is also another high performance class that is a little bit easier to certify into because of her running budding talent. It still has canto and has a higher move stat of 7, though it loses access to flight. For the most part, I think Pegasus Knight outclasses it, but you can't really go wrong with either of these classes. The combination of great mobility and Vengeance to one-round enemies is a huge power spike for the intermediate stage.
Moving on to the advanced stage, we have a couple of realistic options, both of which have their own appealing damage nukes. I mentioned Sniper briefly when discussing her weaknesses, and I'll go into more depth here. First, given her starting rank in bows as well as the fact that she has a boon in them, the certification for this class is comically easy and provides a very good low investment option, especially since Persecution Complex pairs very nicely with Hunter's Volley. On her path to Sniper, she would have also picked up a few other useful combat arts for utility purposes, so it's definitely a good option. The only other major contender for advanced classes would be Wyvern Rider or Paladin. I briefly mentioned that you could go Wyvern Rider to bridge the gap between Pegasus Knight and Falcon Knight, since you might have already pushed Axes for Brigand. If you feel like you are close enough to push Axes a bit more to hit the range where you can start having a chance to certify for Wyvern Rider, then it's a fair option. The class itself is busted, and even without Lancefare, it provides a higher strength bonus than most of the other advanced classes, and extremely good mobility with Flight and Canto. If you don't feel like it's realistic to make that jump though, then Lancefare boosted Vengeance from Paladin is really strong too. Although it lacks Flight, it does have slightly better move at 8 and solid stats across the board, providing Bernie a really strong high mobility nuke option in the advanced stage that is easy to pick up given her boon and lances and budding talent riding. Not only that, but she'll have also acquired Pass, which is available to her when she started training for this class, which also helps her fit into this archetype even more. As for masterclass options, there really only are a few. From Paladin or Wyvern Rider, going Falcon Knight is the obvious choice as it's not too incredibly difficult to certify for her and allows her to fly across the map with 8 movement pass if necessary to nuke specific targets with another class that has lance for boosted vengeance. This is the main advantage Bernadetta has over the 2 other vengeance users, Cyril and Dedu, as they both are male and cannot access this class. Additionally, Dedu struggles to get into flying classes in the first place given he has a Bane for the flying skill. There really isn't too much difference going from Paladin to Falcon Knight, honestly, other than it has great boosts, notably much better speed, as well as being a flyer, of course. The last option is a pretty fun one too, that being Bow Knight Bernadetta. Not only does Bernadetta certify for this class extremely easily given her boons, but she can also get insane range with this class given its innate bow range +2 in conjunction with Deadeye. Combined with the class's 8 move and movement +1, if you pick that up from riding skill rank, it's easily one of the most largest effective range present in this game, allowing her to eliminate or at least chip valuable targets from a country mile away. Obviously, this is a bit more difficult in matting where hit rates are a lot more inconsistent, but you can definitely still make it work, especially since Bernadetta has good decks. Although Bow Knight isn't as tailored towards vengeance as the other class options, there's no reason she can't have it equipped well in this class, as it can still provide very good damage if enemies end up getting close to damage her somehow. Overall, it's probably not her best option since she'll usually lack a consistent nuke, but it's definitely one of the more fun classes to put her in, which is definitely still viable too.
We are confident about putting Bernadetta in the S tier. There are some strong units in the Black Eagles, but aside from Edelgard herself, we think that Bernadetta is a standout among them. The combination of her personal ability, her combat arts, and all the class benefits she gets from being female just makes her one of the most valuable units in the game. None of her flaws really hinder her from fulfilling her role. As for the best way to build her, I think her best endgame class is either Falcon Knight or Bow Knight. The choice may depend on which combat arts you're focusing more on, and how friendly the route you've chosen is to cavalry movement, but for the most part, these will be built in the exact same way. Lance Prowess 5 and Bow Prowess 5 are both great options, but I think you should be making use of both weapon types with Bernadetta, so choosing hit +20 instead can achieve a similar effect as both prowess skills, but saves an ability slot. Death Blow is an essential skill for damage output since it's a player phase focused build. Another no-brainer is Pass. It's such a unique and useful movement buff that there's really no reason to not run it on your build. The rest of her slots are very flexible. Even though you're going to want to use combat arts most of the time, Darting Blow is still pretty useful for both classes since it pairs well with Bernadetta's naturally high speed and her Crest. As for the last slot, Movement +1 is an excellent ability, but it's much more realistic to obtain on the cavalry path. So on Falcon Knight, you might have an easier time getting Lance Crit +10 for the final slot instead, which pairs well with the higher crit rate of Vengeance. These are just some suggestions, but aside from Pass, Death Blow, and some sort of accuracy increasing ability, you could really go with anything. Some other great ability options for this player phase build that we didn't mention yet are Strength +2, Bow Crit +10, HP +5, as well as Lance Fair and Bow Fair if you can manage to reach S+ rank in either weapon type. I briefly mentioned before that I don't think typical enemy phase setups based around Miller Stance Plus are a great idea on Bernadetta because her player phase is too strong to just sacrifice. However, I do think a dual phase setup in Falcon Knight could be really interesting and viable. Pass is just as important for this build as it is for the other build, so that's an easy pick for the first slot. In order to get your Avoid high enough without Alert Stance Plus, you'll most likely need Defiant Avoid, the mastery of Falcon Knight, so this build might take a while to come online. Lance Prowess 5 also provides another important boost to Avoid and patches up hit rates at the same time. To get your crit rates high enough, you will need Battalion Wrath alongside a Killer Lance Plus. Finally, since this is a dual phase setup, you will definitely need Death Blow for player phase damage output. Basically, the goal of this build is to fly around at below 25% HP and nuke an enemy using Vengeance with a Killer Lance Plus during the player phase. Meanwhile, you'll still be able to dodge all attacks and counterattack enemies with crits from Battalion Wrath during the enemy phase. I don't have a lot of experience using this myself, but just from theory crafting, this could be one of the best ways to utilize your full kit. That's about all we have to say about Bernadetta. If you enjoyed the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment. I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels. If you're following our Persona overview series, the next episode will be released on Saturday on Jeff's channel. As for this series, stay tuned for the next episode of Unit Overview, which is about the next member of the Black Eagle House, Caspar von Bergelies, on my channel next Tuesday. Thanks for watching.
Anywhere I can hide.